As everybody likes to be honored, so people imagine that God also wants to be honored. They forget that the fulfillment of duty towards men is the only honor adequate to him. Thus is formed the conception of a religion of worship, instead of a merely moral religion. Apart from moral conduct, all that man thinks himself able to do in order to become acceptable to God is mere superstition and religious folly. If once a man has come to the idea of a service which is not purely moral, but is supposed to be agreeable to God himself, or capable of propitiating him, there is little difference between the several ways of serving him, for all these ways are of equal value. Whether the devotee accomplishes his statutory walk to the church, or whether he undertakes a pilgrimage to the sanctuaries of Loreto and Palestine, whether he repeats his prayer formulas with his lips, or like the Tibetan, uses a prayer wheel, is quite indifferent. As the illusion of thinking that a man can justify himself before God in any way by acts of worship is religious superstition, so the illusion that he can obtain this justification by the so-called intercourse with God is religious mysticism. Such superstition leads inevitably to sacerdotalism, which will always be found where the essence is sought not in principles of morality, but in statutory commandments, rules of faith and observances. Immanuel Kant. Cite this quote. Quote source, as quoted in German Thought, from the 7 Years' War to Goethe's Death, 6 lectures by Karl Hillebrand, p. 208. Successively freed from all statutes based on history, and one purely moral religion rule over all, in order that God might be all in all. The veil must fall. The leading string of sacred tradition with all its appendices becomes by degrees useless, and at last a fetter. The humiliating difference between laymen and clergymen must disappear, and equality spring from true liberty. All this, however, must not be expected from an exterior revolution, which acts violently, and depends upon fortune in the principle of pure moral religion, which is a sort of divine revelation constantly taking place in the soul of man, must be sought the ground for a passage to the new order of things, which will be accomplished by slow and successive reforms. Immanuel Kant. Cite this quote. Quote source, as quoted in German Thought, from the 7 Years' War to Goethe's Death, 6 lectures by Karl Hillebrand, p. 208. Have patience a while. Slanders are not long-lived. Truth is the child of time. Ere long she shall appear to vindicate thee. Immanuel Kant. Cite this quote. Quote source, as quoted in Gems of Thought edited by Charles Northend. The death of dogma is the birth of morality. Immanuel Kant. Cite this quote. Quote source, as quoted in Faith or Fact by Henry Morehouse Tabor, p. 86. Immanuel Kant. By a lie a man throws away and, as it were, annihilates his dignity as a man. By a lie a man throws away and, as it were, annihilates his dignity as a man. A man who himself does not believe what he tells another has even less worth than if he were a mere thing. Makes himself a mere deceptive appearance of man, not man himself. Immanuel Kant. Cite this quote. Quote source, Doctrine of Virtue as translated by Mary J. Gregor, p. 93. I come now to another part of my system, and because it suggests a lofty idea of the plan of creation, it appears to me as the most seductive. The sequence of ideas that led us to it is very simple and natural. They are as follows. Let us imagine a system of stars gathered together in a common plane, like those of the Milky Way, but situated so far away from us that even with the telescope we cannot distinguish the stars composing it. Let us assume that its distance, compared to that separating us from the stars of the Milky Way, is the same proportion as the Milky Way is to the distance from the Earth to the Sun. Such a stellar world will appear to the observer, who contemplates it at so enormous a distance, only as a little spot feebly illumined and subtending a very small angle. Its shape will be circular, if its plane is perpendicular to the line of sight, elliptical, if it is seen obliquely. The faintness of its light, its form, and its appreciable diameter will obviously distinguish such a phenomenon from the isolated stars around it. We do not need to seek far in the observations of astronomers to meet with such phenomena. They have been seen by various observers, who have wondered at their strange appearance, have speculated about them, and have suggested sometimes the most amazing explanations, sometimes theories which were more rational, but which had no more foundation than the former. We refer to the nebula, or, more precisely, to a particular kind of celestial body which M.D. Maupertuis describes as follows. These are small luminous patches, only slightly more brilliant than the dark background of the sky. They have this in common, that their shapes are more or less open ellipses, and their light is far more feeble than that of any other objects to be perceived in the heavens. It is much more natural and reasonable to assume that a nebula is not a unique and solitary sun, but a system of numerous suns, which appear crowded, because of their distance, into a space so limited that their light, which would be imperceptible were each of them isolated, suffices, owing to their enormous numbers, to give a pale and uniform luster. Their analogy with our own system of stars, their form, which is precisely what it should be according to our theory, the faintness of their light, which denotes an infinite distance, all are in admirable accord and lead us to consider these elliptical spots as systems of the same order as our own. In a word, to be Milky Way is similar to the one whose constitution we have explained. And if these hypotheses, in which analogy and observation consistently lend mutual support, have the same merit as formal demonstrations, we must consider the existence of such systems as demonstrated. We see that scattered through space out to infinite distances, there exist similar systems of stars, and that creation, in the whole extent of its infinite grandeur, is everywhere organized into systems whose members are in relation with one another. A vast field lies open to discoveries, and observations alone will give the key.